Okay, welcome. Welcome to panel 2, Domestic Influences on China's U.S. Policy. My name is Wenhong Chen. I'm an associate professor in the Moody College of Communication at UT Austin. So first of all, I'd like to thank Josh to have me here. It's my tremendous pleasure reading all the 3 papers in the panel. Also, Eric's paper in the first panel. So we have about 120 minutes, just ahead of lunch. So as the moderator, I will impose very strict rules. So each of our paper will have 35 minutes, presentation and Q&A included. So I think I will let our authors first present their work, and then we will have this Q&A. And then we still have about 15 minutes at the end. We can bring the whole panel and the audience member together to discuss the panel and the larger issue as a whole. Okay, so without any further ado, let's start with our first paper by Jessica Chen Weiss.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much to Josh and to Sam for putting this together and hosting us in Austin. It's a little hard to get out of Ithaca, but it's nice to be here with the good weather. So this paper is really kind of meant as a reply to, or an intervention into this question of whether Chinese nationalism is rising, which is to say it's may or may not be rising, but the question that the paper suggests we need to be confronting is whether or not the set of attitudes that the Chinese government faces in dealing with a potentially restive public, are they becoming more hawkish or not? And this question of national identity in the typical ways that national identity and nationalism have been measured in the survey literature, in some ways don't provide us with a whole lot of empirical traction on that question. And so the paper analyzes the results of 4 different surveys to look at a different set of attitudes, namely, should the Chinese government be investing more in its military, even at the expense of social welfare, and whether or not the Chinese government should rely more on military strength in conducting its foreign policy. So the sort of foil for the piece, if you will, is Ian Johnston's recent piece, which concludes that no, in fact, Chinese nationalism is not rising, and that, in fact, this younger generation that grew up on a diet of patriotic education, he finds is actually less nationalistic than older generations, as measured by statements like, China is a better country than most, you should support your country even when it's in the wrong, and I would prefer to be a citizen of China. So on these sort of national identity measures, perhaps nationalism is on the wane in China. But I argue that these identities may or may not be sort of linear, like neatly sort of associated with preferences over how China should conduct its foreign policy. You may be a citizen of the world, but actually still believe that China has as every much right to these, say, islands as any other country, and that these aren't, it doesn't require that kind of beliefs about the intrinsic superiority of the Chinese culture or whatever to have these foreign policy preferences. So the 4 surveys, 3 of them are national, 1 of them is specific to Beijing. 2 of them were conducted in 2012, looking at masses and elites, and 1 was a netizen-only survey, and the final one was the Beijing area study, which looks at Beijing residents over time. Since you've all read the paper, I won't be too detailed. Just the snapshot is that when you disaggregate the mass responses to this question of whether or not China should rely more on its military strength in foreign policy, the younger generations are less likely the younger generations are more likely to believe that China should rely on its military strength in foreign policy than the older generations, and that hawkish sentiment also accords with how elites that were surveyed in 2012 also feel. Netizens, perhaps not surprisingly for all that we've read about the angry youth, particularly online, they too tend to espouse this more hawkish attitude. As a sort of a kind of a robustness check, or just to kind of further look in at whether this trend in hawkish attitudes is also captured in other surveys, I looked at the Beijing area study, which is what Johnston uses for his finding. He was generous enough in making these data available. We also see, looking at a different measure, whether or not this one of this guns and butter trade-off, whether China should invest more in guns, so to speak, than in butter. That too, it's quite interesting to see the trend over time, where you see, with really the one exception of the global financial crisis, that 2009 period, you see ever growing numbers that think that China should invest in guns rather than in butter. Or the way that the question is actually phrased is, should China decrease military spending? And the number of those that agree with that statement, or who have this dovish view, that dovish proportion of the public of the Beijing residents at least, has diminished over time. So I think in terms of feedback, this is a very first draft. I'm very interested in your thoughts on the framing of the piece. I think quite well aware that as we talk about domestic drivers, this is really an attempt to map the landscape of preferences that then may feed into a sort of a causal process where the leadership has to grapple with either public opinion itself, maybe fearing unrest, which is the subject of much of my initial wave of research. But it could also be that elites within the Chinese government are looking to the public and potentially using those sentiments to put pressure on intra-elite discussions of foreign policy. So it may not be that these attitudes directly force the government to do anything, but these are the sort of set of factors that could inform, constrain, or be useful in a sort of intra-elite discussion as to what direction China should take its foreign policy. That said, there's a lot of potential limitations to looking at these kinds of survey data. One, there's sort of a snapshot in time, and a few different snapshots in time. And they don't, and I think in particular, don't capture the sort of dynamic formation of opinion. The Chinese government has a good deal of ability to manipulate and manage public opinion, and have invested heavily in those tools. In the Netizen survey that I ran with the co-author at Yale, we looked experimentally at whether or not the Chinese government could use its framing abilities, essentially, to massage and manipulate public reactions. And we found that indeed certain messages, particularly the logic of biding time or talking tough, we call it bluster, but talking tough without a lot of action follow through, which I think it resonates quite well with the paper by Brantly and Yaping. That this sort of a lot of noise but not a lot of follow through, that also can be effective in sort of assuaging public demands for a tough response. And finally, lest this be kind of all doom and gloom kind of a story, I suggest that there may not be that these hawkish attitudes don't necessarily lead to the conclusion that the Chinese government would be tempted to engage in diversionary behavior to accompany the slowing of the economy. This is not directly the focus of the paper, but there is a sort of a logical step, a conclusion that could be drawn, which is that in fact these hawkish attitudes make it more risky for the government to engage in foreign adventurism, because they can't guarantee at this moment that adventurism would result in a successful outcome. And so this could actually blow back and burn the Chinese government. So in fact, that these attitudes could counsel restraint and prudence, at least in this current period where the Chinese government and military capabilities can't ensure necessarily a resounding military success, but particularly in its territorial disputes. So that's sort of where I'll leave it at that. I really look forward to your comments.
Great, thank you. So, shall we open the floor to our audience? I first collect a few questions and then you can address, and if we still have time, we can go a second round. Any questions? Yes, and because we are a relatively small group, please identify yourself before you raise your question.
Ming from Boston University, and Jessica, congratulations, finally in person. So I really liked the piece. It's very easy to read and very well written and very nicely done. Like all your other works, I enjoy reading it. My question may not be addressed in this research, but I think it's quite important to evaluate how public opinion really can, the values of public opinions might influence foreign policy. If it does, and what kind of government measures or mechanisms that to evaluate or to gauge public opinions in China. Among all polities, I think the Chinese Communist Party has all the instruments available. If you can get the public opinion, I think what do they do? So the second is whether your survey has a follow-up to identify the hawkish rhetoric versus a hawkish policy choice. The reason I ask this is I spend lots of time in China talking to private entrepreneurs, and they are very hawkish, and they advocate wars over South China Sea. And then when you probe them, they say, oh, I know it's not going to happen. So talk is cheap. That not only applies to the government, but also to these individuals. So whether your survey might, the very reason that the Chinese public, when they speak, it shows the nationalist or hawkish trend is because they don't think they can affect the outcome.
Please.
Josh Buckley from the WJ School. I think you introduced me to some of the survey market research firms that you work with. Thanks much for coming today. I guess I wanted to maybe ask you to expand on the idea of the role of elite cues in shaping Chinese public opinion, and maybe the extent to which both the elite cues can shape public opinion, but also is it possible for the public opinion to maybe become a constraint on the elites in the same way that you suggested that if expectations are not met, if an effort was not successful with adventurism, there would be the potential for blowback. I wonder if there's worry about uncontained nationalism, and so is there the scope for elite cues to kind of gin up either hawkishness or wider feelings of nationalism that then would be like a genie out of the bottle, and maybe there could be some intersection with like the elite cues literature that has been done in the U.S., like Kissinger and Saunders had a really decent ISQ on U.S. public opinion, and maybe we had the opportunity to do more experimental work in China to see there's issue area variation on that.
Yes.
I'm Lauren Dickey at King's College London. I had a question about methods and a question about causality. Regarding methods, I was curious, the 3 surveys that aren't the Beijing survey, how urban was defined, if it's tier 1 cities, tier 3 cities, if there are urban areas that are in close proximity to, say, big hubs of PLA-related industry in Shanxi or in Sichuan province, for instance, and what impact that could potentially have upon the data that you've got. And then relatedly, and I know you've done this quite wonderfully in other articles and books that you've written, the causality for me would be helpful to have a little bit in your piece, kind of what triggered the survey respondents to respond the way they did. Why are younger generations less hawkish than older generations, for instance?
Maybe we save the questions for the second round so that Jessica can address the first 3 if we get too many questions to deal with.
Great, thank you. lots to think about here. And one of the difficulties with these surveys is that you don't necessarily get the layer beneath. So why did they respond the way that they did? In the netizen survey that I did, we did actually ask some open-ended questions and had asked respondents to say why they believe what they did. And there's that entails a lot more qualitative work, and I don't, off the top of my head, can't pull out the responses that would necessarily shed light on some of these questions. So it's really interesting. That you had people who advocated war but then didn't think it would happen, and then they were perfectly content with that, or were they angry at the government and wanted it to be otherwise, or was there a sense that in due time things will change, and that's so there's a lot of different. I would be interested in overall sort of how much that led to a disapproval or sort of a complacency or a contentment. But this is the very first pass, so there's a lot more of this texture and context that should be added. Josh, on the elite cues, I was trying not to sort of double dip here and present or include all the work that Alan Defoe and I have done, which really looks at this elite cue issue. One of that survey experiment was also run over time, and so we looked at the effect of the real world FONOPs, the resumption of those in the South China Sea, and I think that gives us some sort of sense of how in real time do elite messages and real world events, what's the balance? Like how much are these negative external events able to be overcome by government messaging, and on net, how does public approval of the government, or sort of their evaluation of the government's performance change? Because I think that you have this, it's not really an arms race, but you have multiple inputs, and so in an experiment we could lay out the government's rhetorical strategies to say, yeah, we're doing all this tough stuff, when in fact maybe they aren't, and they're also simultaneously highlighting how terrible all these foreign transgressions or provocations are. And so, what is the sort of the net effect of that information? In that paper, we find that it does have a slightly negative effect. That when the Chinese government, unable to fully hide from view these foreign the FONOPs, the U.S. FONOPs in the South China Sea, there's a slight dip in Chinese approval of the government's foreign policy performance on this issue area. So that provides at least sort of the initial inklings of evidence that even with full control over sort of messaging and propaganda and censorship, that there's still leakage, if you will, that makes the Chinese government look worse, even though they're trying to sort of bolster their popular image. I don't know across issue areas though, and thanks for reminding me that I need to incorporate this. Elizabeth Saunders and Alex Geisinger's recent paper. That's really interesting to look. I mean, I've been sort of really focused on the security issues here, but there could be a huge range, right? And things might look very different across other areas. And then Lauren, urban was defined, so this was the Research Center on Contemporary China. This is their sampling strategy. For the early years of those studies, they used household registration lists, so I assume it was urban hukou. Over time, they've switched to a GPS-assisted sampling based on grids, satellite grids, and so I have to go back and look at their strategy for identifying sort of urban versus non-urban localities. It is a nationally representative sample, so I would be surprised. I wouldn't expect there to be any effect of proximity to a military region. But thanks also for inviting me again to think more about why we see this change over time. I speculate a little bit on whether this patriotic education has or has not been successful. I mean, this could just be a simple power story. China's getting more powerful. Younger respondents think we should use it, or we should get what there should be a corresponding change in the kind of distribution of goods in this, in the region, and China's interests should be served. It could also be, so I don't know. I mean, I actually invite you to speculate with me as to what's going on here. Is this it could also be the lack of experience with, conflict, and so this, not really knowing what it would mean as much as older generations to fight for these territories. That's in this sort of territorial dispute context. Maybe life is getting pretty good, so further investments in social welfare, on balance, why not invest more in the military now that we all have, iPhones or whatever. It's like things are changing. It's not as desperate a domestic situation from the perspective of those who are, I guess, answering these surveys. So these are, but I wouldn't, there's no way that this research is going to, I'm in this venue happy to toss out all of these. I think that a more grounded speculation would be called for in a formal paper, but lots of open-ended questions as to why attitudes are changing.
We still have 15 minutes for Jessica's paper, so let's collect another round of questions. I saw Professor Zhao has a question. Ask and Brett, please.
Okay, two questions here. One is that you did the survey 2012, 2015. So these two periods, one is before Xi Jinping came to office, one is after Xi Jinping came to office. I would assume these two periods will be very different. And how do you distinguish these two periods in your survey design? And also, you use the Chinese companies to survey. How do you make sure they will do the things right? Because especially in 2015 under Xi Jinping, the audio control is already very, very tight, and university professors, I talked to them, they are very difficult to do objective research. So under this type of political environment, how do you think the data you collected were reliable? So this is one technical issue. Second is a bigger question about the impact of this kind of public sentiments and foreign policy making. This type of sentiments would be much more powerful before Xi Jinping came to office. Hu Jintao was very weak, so the impact of public opinions would be much more meaningful at that time. So since Xi Jinping came to office, we have not seen any nationalistic demonstrations. He basically said, I'm doing the job, you don't have to do the job now. I mean, he mobilized those ambassadors to protect Japan, like newspaper op-eds everywhere in the world. So how, in that context, do you see this type of public opinions of nationalist sentiments can be linked to the foreign policy front? So these are.
Very good. Yaping, you have the question from last round. Yes, please.
I really enjoyed reading the paper. It's very thought-provoking. You should see all my scribbles all over the page. In terms of framing, to detangle your argument a little bit, I feel you're really making three specific arguments. So first, is the Chinese public hawkish in the year specifically 2012 or 2015? And the second, is the younger generation more hawkish than the older generation? And third, are the Chinese people becoming more hawkish? I feel the first two are really convincing. Based on the data you presented in figure 1. But the third one is overwhelmingly dependent on the data presented in figure 2. The question asked to the respondents is whether you should think China should reduce defense spending in order to improve social welfare. But I don't know how the survey was done, but if the trade-off was not made explicit to the respondents, it's hard for them to understand why China has to sacrifice defense budget in terms to improve social welfare. And also, there's this thinking, one asks someone whether they should spend more on defense, maybe some people would think that China should have a big army commensurate with the big rising status of China, not necessarily for aggressive purpose. So that would be a challenge to drive to drive to this conclusion that the Chinese people are becoming more hawkish.
Josh, and then Professor Sutter.
I mean, just to add to this list of things that could have driven, right, and we would never know, we might as well pile one on top, is that, especially as Sam said, the political environment's changed in 2015. The safest response you can give is, yes, national security first, right? That's the safe response. Anything different than that is less safe if you are assuming that this is going to come out, somehow you'll be connected to it. Now, I'm not saying the respondents had such a view, but if you think about maybe even 1%, then you still have a skewing towards a more hawkish view that may or may not represent the true view of the respondent. Now, again, no way to know this. This is one of these known unknowns, but added to the list of things that may be driving results. Did you see the paper by Gary King et al. In APSR about the manipulation of, right? So the question would be, right, if you believe that the Chinese Communist Party has gotten so good at manipulating public opinion that they can say, look over here, and people, a certain percentage will, that they're being very, very scientific and calculating, then maybe hawkish public opinion is a well. And you can either go to the well and withdraw the water if you need it, but if you don't, as Francis and Yaping's, same person, right? Yaping and Brantly's paper talks about, if you find yourself in a situation with Vietnam and you do not wish to draw the water, you've got enough control to say, we're not drawing the water on this issue, we'll save the water for another time and deploy it kind of as necessary. And if you believe that they've actually got that much control, then hawkish public opinion becomes irrelevant. It's just a kind of, like I said, a well you go to when you need it, but when you don't need it, it's not a problem because you can make sure that the patriotic protests don't come out, right? You use your security services. So I think this is, how do you perceive of public opinion? Is it a driver of something, or is it a resource for the regime? And I'll leave that to you to kind of sort it out. One other point I want to put out there in a controversial way, right, is that this date 2009, perhaps not surprisingly, is being repeated, right, and independently repeated in Sam's paper, repeated in your paper. I believe it may be in your paper as well, but I think generally this has been a consensus that 2009 is this tipping point change, and of course this is before Xi Jinping is taking over, right, and so there's and actually, just to let you know, my co-author on my last book, Ambassador Chen, was in China with Yang Jiechi when a lot of this stuff was happening. He said Yang Jiechi was just as happy as he could be, right? Right? Just excited about the prospect that China could finally deploy its more assertive strategy. And so one question, again, controversial, is does this suggest that the Taogang Yanghui strategy was really abiding your time and that 2009 happened, strategic opportunity, we jump on it, right? And this would suggest that there was maybe not a 100-year marathon, but there was some kind of strategic waiting period until the opportunity revealed itself. Now again, how do you come up with proof of that? I don't know. But seeing 2009 repeated again and again, and 2009 is the year where people were concerned that the Western system was coming apart. It would be the year, if you were a conspiracy theorist, that you would go to. And so I just want to put it out there for everybody that it's interesting this year has been repeated in so many papers.
Very insightful comments. Professor.
Yeah, I'm sort of following these two very good comments and with a much more direct appeal. You're steeped into understanding the Chinese nationalism, and so what I'd like to see is your wisdom. Okay, you presented all this data, but what exactly will this amount to as far as the United States is concerned? This is about U.S.-China relations, and so will it lead to foreign policy actions? Will it, does it push them in one direction or another? Because you lead off with Ian Johnson's assessment, it's not moving in that direction. So you sort of refute that and say, oh no, it is. Just put yourself, Mr. Chillison's coming to the campus. He says, what the heck does all this mean? You say, tell him. Tell him what, in other words, you really know this. And so incorporate your wisdom and in some place, I think it would be very useful if you could do that. Obviously you can't say exactly what it would mean, but you can say a bit more than what you say, because the reader's just left with, oh, okay, you know, and you just don't know. And I think that's what it's a little frustrating for a reader. It's not that it's excellent. It's an excellent paper, but it just doesn't tell you what does this mean. You know, how important is it and why? And I know you can do that. Great.
Wonderful. I feel like we not only have extremely high quality papers, we also have extremely high quality comments.
And high quality moderation.
Thank you. The moderator has a question. So I see all these questions and comments about the theoretical framework, the larger picture implications. And my question is actually built on Yaping's previous comments. As a sociologist, I focus on methodology, the measurement and the analysis. So my first question is about this measurement of hawkish attitude. Based on the paper, it seems that only one question is used to measure hawkish attitude based on one item. Do you think maybe more questions about Chinese political attitude on hawkish or dovish issues should be included? My second question is about, because Yaping already talked about this gun butter question, so whether people feel like Chinese government spend too much on military instead of investing in social welfare. This is kind of like a so-called double barrel question, right? So probably, it's forcing the survey participant to make a choice between gun or butter. And additional question, I think also built on many comments we already have here. So I wonder why you use 35 years of old as the cutting point. Because if you want to really capture the generational differences in political attitude, I think in China, many scholars would use these post-70, post-80, post-90, and then the new millennium generation. I also wonder whether in the survey you would have social demographic variables like income, like a geographic location, like education, to tell us more about this variation of political attitude by significant social demographic and social economic variables. So I'm stop here.
Great. Thanks so much for all this really valuable feedback. I guess I would lump these into categories of things I can't do anything about and things I can do anything about. And the things that I can't do anything about are one, how socially sensitive, how much might that be biasing the results? I guess, Station, I would point to an article, I think that was published in your journal, where, that respondents actually were pretty sincere in responding to some of these survey questions. So the data may not be, or the responses may not be as, falsified or tweaked for given the political environment as you might imagine. In fact, these kinds of opinions are regularly expressed on the internet and in conversation without any political repercussions. It's really this collective action is the issue that, again, the studies by King et al. Have shown that are more likely to be deleted, etc. And so just simply suggesting a preference along the questions, it seems like these aren't that sensitive. Let's see. I think that there are, to the larger, so there's clearly a lot of other things that I could do to make the kind of result, come at it from different perspectives. These are not surveys, aside from the netizen survey, these are not surveys that I designed, so I'm limited by the questions that were asked. This guns versus butter is one that was included in the BAS over time, so I used it. There is a simpler question of, do you think you should invest more or decrease military spending? So that could help alleviate some of this, or at least help complement the results here, as well as looking at different generational divides. I think this larger question of, what does this amount to, and, what does the public opinion matter more under Hu Jintao than under Xi Jinping? Is it more of a reservoir? I've always thought of it as sort of a reservoir that the government could draw on, and it costs the government to keep the water in the well, if you will, to suppress these sentiments. It's not an easy on or off decision, but nonetheless, I think that there's still a significant amount of government discretion here. And so what does this add up to from a U.S. policymaker's perspective is, when we see evidence of it, I think it should be regarded as real rather than totally manufactured or ginned up. And the very fact that, under Xi Jinping, we haven't seen nationalist demonstrations, if we then do see some, we should take them seriously. And then I would get, I think, another potential takeaway is that, we're seeing incredible amounts of sort of people-to-people integration. And you see whatever, it's like China-fornia or whatever else. There's a lot of back and forth. But that kind of change in identity, or rather sort of what appear to be very similar kind of at a personal level compatibility, doesn't seem to be, I think, reflected in preferences over, foreign policy and military strategy. And this may or may not be something that is just an over time trend, but it is, there may be a trend over time, but there is also, I just think, this fundamental fact. Going back to, when I was, a friend at Stanford who is now a very successful investment banker, Chinese, back and forth between Silicon Valley, and I asked him, if, there were a war over Taiwan, he was like, I'd sign up tomorrow and go fight. It's like, blue. So it's like, even though at a very, human level, we co-founded this U.S.-China Student Leaders Forum to build friendships and all that stuff, that kind of identity, I think, on those issues, it's not necessarily translating into the sort of kind of peaceful foreign policy or dovish foreign policy preference. So I think that's sort of where I'm at, but there's a lot more here that I think could be added to this sort of relatively skeletal draft, if you will, and there's room. So I look forward to doing that, and thank you all for your very constructive suggestions.
Great timing. Thank you so much. Thank you. So let's now move on to our second paper by Professor Brantly, Womack, and Yaping Wang.
Well, Yaping is the primary author of this paper and the originator of the theory of media instrumentality that's described in the paper. So I'm just the warm-up band in introducing the case that we talk about. And basically, it might seem a little strange to be talking about China-Vietnam confrontations in a conference on U.S.-China relations and domestic forces. But I think that if we look at China and Vietnam, we can get a better sense of the types of media options and media intentions of the leadership in China than we could by looking directly at U.S.-China relations. In part because there's no country more similar to China than Vietnam, and no country more similar to Vietnam than China. So we can see, in a sense, we're seeing something similar, a state party capacity on both sides that's quite similar. Whereas if we're looking at U.S.-China relations, we have a responsible stakeholder on one side. I'm not going to say which side at the moment, and things are very different. So the case that we're looking at is the most prominent case in recent Chinese-Vietnamese confrontation. It was the move of the very expensive, state-of-the-art exploration and drilling platform into disputed waters between China and Vietnam. There's several things worth noting about this. One, it was not part of a general deterioration in Chinese-Vietnamese relations. The sovereignty dispute's been there. And actually things, if anything, were slightly improving. So there certainly weren't any breakthroughs. And this wasn't a dramatic move in the other direction from the current policy direction. It was different. Secondly, the Paracel Islands are the question, which is only a bilateral claim of China and Vietnam. It's not the Spratly Islands or the Nine Dash Line which are things that involve 5.5 claimants if you count Taiwan as a half claimant on the China claim. So it's more restricted. And then there's considerable dispute on why China, who made the decision for the platform to be put there. And from our research, we don't think it was some deliberate, comprehensive act of the Chinese government to antagonize or to challenge Vietnam's claim, but something at least more complicated than that. And one reason is that the Vietnamese experts in China who would normally be consulted about a crisis, this would clearly be an impending crisis if it was intended to be that type of move by central government, they weren't consulted. They read about it in the newspapers. So it's not likely to be a top leadership deliberate action. Something that more happened, which does happen especially between large and small countries. So asymmetric relationships are particularly complex. So then it happened, and once it happened, neither side could easily back down from the confrontation. Neither side wanted this to be a casus belli. Neither side wanted it to lead to some larger conflict, but neither side also could easily back down. So here they have a confrontation. And if we look at U.S.-China relations, think of the EP3 incident. The spy plane incident in 2001. That would be an analogous type of incident. So what do you do? And the interesting thing that happened that Yaping will be talking about is that China and Vietnam looked like they took very different strategies, and yet they both had the same end of wanting to prevent an escalation of conflict. So what happened eventually? The platform was the Chinese declared, just as we should have declared victory in Vietnam sometime in the early 60s, the Chinese declared victory in their oil exploration, and smooth and successful and completion on time, actually a month before time. They pulled the rig out. It hasn't returned to these waters, and there hasn't been a conflict like this since then. Then within 2 months, there was a major group of top Vietnamese military leaders to Beijing to talk to their counterparts and to prevent analogous risk to the relationship in the future. And there hasn't been anything quite like this. So that's the incident. Now, Yaping will explain the different behaviors of the governments.
So I'll just say a little bit about the theory and how it applies to this case. To make it less boring, Professor Womack told me of an Aesop fable yesterday that I thought would be really befitting to introduce the theory. So Satyr met a man and saw the man blowing into his fingers on a cold winter night. And he asked the man, "Why do you do that?" And the man said, "To warm my hands." And later he saw the man blowing into his soup, a bowl of hot soup. And he asked again, "Why do you do that?" And he said, and the man said, to cool up my hands, to cool up my soup. This is where the phrase "blowing hot and cold" comes from. But the story itself suggests that the man, but in our case, states, could use the same action to achieve the exact opposite results. So the theory accounts for the variations in state media behaviors in interstate disputes in a general sense. Rhetoric and propaganda have proven to be anything but epiphenomenal in international disputes. So if read carefully, they could tell us the true intentions. So this theory proposes two critical factors that we think account for the adoption or non-adoption of state propaganda campaigns in territorial disputes, existing public opinion and state foreign policy intent. So if the two are misaligned, the state uses propaganda to bring the public in line with the intended foreign policy. So this includes two different kinds of propaganda. One mobilizing kind, which is commonly known, just like the blowing to warm it up, and one pacifying kind, which is less known but still commonly practiced, just like the blowing to cool it off. So the rationale behind a pacifying propaganda campaign is that the state could use the propaganda to keep up the appearances of a hard stand, to appease the strong public opinion, and at the same time allowing the public to moderate the public opinion by echoing their emotions, like how you would do to comfort an angry kid, or let them directly vent on social media to release their anger. We've demonstrated how these mechanisms work in the Vietnamese side of the story, so that they release the public anger so that they could pursue a relatively moderate policy. And on the Chinese side is the opposite story, that we have a relatively calm public and also a moderate intending state, so that the state and the public are relatively aligned, so that the state does not need to use propaganda to pacify the public. So in this sense, the Chinese actually, they refrained from publicizing it. They even censored relative content.
Very good. Questions? Yes?
On the drilling rig incident, could you clarify whether anything was actually discovered from the time they had it there? Because most of the commercial discoveries of oil and gas are further south in clearly Vietnamese waters. So was it just a stake of claim, or did they really feel that there was some oil and gas potential there?
You're right. This was these Paracel Islands are across from central Vietnam, and you look at the oil that has been developed by Viet Petro and especially with the Soviets, initially Soviets and Russian cooperation off of Bong Tao. That's a good 400 or 500 miles to the south. I don't know whether it certainly was not part of the initial. When they pulled the rig, they didn't say that it had been successful or unsuccessful, except as an exploration.
I've read some speculations, but I'm not sure that they are true or not. So before the Chinese oil rig was placed there were some information about that. There's not a good prospect of finding oil there. But after the oil rig was retreated, the Chinese side claimed that they find oil in there, but I'm not sure whether that's true.
Josh?
Yeah. By the way, I didn't say it before, Jessica, but I really liked your paper. I just got right into it, right? And similarly, I really enjoyed this. Now, here's my question, and it's, having Brantly here is perfect, right? So, applying your theory of asymmetric relations, we would expect the larger power, which is paying so much less attention to the smaller power, to do precisely this, kind of blunder, right? They didn't consult the experts, they didn't uncoordinated, they didn't pay much attention, it didn't matter much to them. And then on the Vietnam side, they're hyper-focused, it matters a lot to them, it affects, their sense of self, autonomy, all of the things you talk about in your work, right? So I think one thing you could do is actually use your work a little better. To display why you see these effects, because they are very much coordinated with the theory, right? And you can quote yourself nicely to make it the case. Also, the EP3 incident would help to elucidate this, because in the EP3 incident you've got a major power, and so you have a Chinese response which is very different than when you have a minor power, and the response is kind of commiserate in terms of size. Again, a nice application of the theory where you could say, well, here we had a similar incident, and China responded differently, and the size of the countries they were dealing with matters. The PLA's role is also interesting and somewhat underdeveloped in the paper. So, it seems like there was all these experts are kind of left on the side, but yet these multiple rings of Navy ships, right? So somebody in the Bai Dalo was consulted, right? And so, was this somebody's kind of happy hunting expedition? can we trace that back to a certain group of people with a certain political motivation for doing this? Certainly, as you know, in my paper, I do think there's domestic politics. So is there any domestic politics in the PLA's decision to be supportive of this? Right? Because you can't sail that thing out there without these ships. So somebody at some level, perhaps the chairman of the CMC, said okay to this, right? So I think that that's a kind of an interesting thing to tease out a little bit more in the paper. Also, you know, I'm going to the asymmetry theory, this idea of public sentiment. You write, I hear, you know, the public sentiment in China, they just didn't care that much. Right? Again, that just reflects the argument in the theory, right? We would expect the public sentiment to not care that much. But in Vietnam, completely different. Again, conforming with the theory. Not only the public sentiment, but also the behavior at the elite levels conforms so nicely that I think it's just almost a no-brainer to fit that in there as an help to explain what's going on.
So the criticism of Jessica and me is that we're too humble. You know, we should involve our research more. Okay. I think we can accept that criticism.
Quote yourself more.
No, you're right. It does fit, and it fits general criticisms of Chinese, the lack of coordination, Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, you know, and it's as far as domestic actors go, we start with the oil companies, and I think the real question, PLA is not. You know, you had a lot more Coast Guard and paramilitary fishing boat type of involvement than direct naval involvement. It'd be very interesting to know precise details on the chronology of the boat coming out, the Vietnamese boat response. There are hundreds of little boats involved in bumping into each other. Mainly reported in the Western press as the Chinese bumping into the Vietnamese boats. It was definitely going in both directions. And yet, as the details of our paper point out, both sides pretty careful not to have those bumps turn into some type of a crisis, turn into an EP3 situation where people are dying and becoming heroes. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah. One other point to this very exact point, so I'll just throw it on there. The idea that the Vietnamese were casting about for foreign intervention to aid them also is suggestive that they were trying to balance this highly asymmetric relationship where the Chinese didn't want anybody's interference, right? So again, that reflects the theory quite nicely. We would expect a smaller power to seek a counterbalancing from either, you know, diplomatic or otherwise. So,
So in terms of the PLA's role, so I think for any person studying Chinese politics, it's always difficult to open this black box, right? Mm-hmm. So, but our logical deduction is that seeing from the scale of the military presence, it's hard to imagine that the PLA was not involved. And our interview to a senior scholar with access, who claimed access to policy making, she said it's without the top leadership at the beginning, which contradicts the crisis group argument that, you know, the Xi was directly involved. So it's really hard to take, you know, like decide on whose remarks is true. But overall, I think this image of uncoordinated, like without consultations for the real experts on this issue was true.
But there could be, you think of non-central coordination. You could imagine the oil companies having their friends since they're already operating in South China Sea, having their friends in local military and, you know, involving the PLA at that, you know, hey, we're moving the oil rig here, could you help us? Mm-hmm. That type of thing.
Yes.
Collusion rather than coordination.
I think this paper has really two very interesting questions. You know, the first one is the oil rig by Simon, and to me that in itself, it tells a lot about the Chinese state and the lack of coordination. Because if you guys found anything and how this happened, you know, which actor, which group made a mistake, or and how they were reined in or later consulting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the new National Security Council, and the new administration. And that in itself I thought would be really interesting, and you perhaps will get questions on that. The second one, which is the one that the paper focuses on, the Chinese later response to this mini crisis and the control, the media coverage. And I agree with the asymmetric explanation, but it can be interpreted differently. And so the China is bigger because the asymmetry, you guys measure it by the GDP and the economic dependence. But it could be measured by the relatively weight given to these bilateral foreign relations. And granted that Vietnam sees this relationship very important to them, but how to deal with Vietnam is also very, very central to the Chinese regional policy. Because before 2014, before 2013, the elite level, they all see their regional policy being failure. Their policy toward the South China Sea were not successful, and public opinion was causing the failure. So by the entry of the Xi administration, and the consensus was we have to make this bilateral and regional relationship work, and to make sure that the public opinions get less involved as possible. So from that point of view, number one is the weight given at this moment in having a successful relationship with Vietnam would actually override the economic asymmetry. So whether you guys can capture that. The second is whether the lack of propaganda it signals a more moderate public opinion over Vietnam. That's the data doesn't show. I guess it's not.
So the first question about the Chinese state intention is a really difficult one. I know most people here are most interested in it. Carl Thayer has enumerated a list of speculations in one of these pieces. It's just hard to judge. That's probably why we focus on the media's side of the story. So we see this case, the interesting variation between the Chinese and the Vietnamese media behaviors. So one is trying to make it as big as possible and launching a massive propaganda campaign, and the other is just responding whenever necessary, the Chinese side. So we are just focusing on that for this piece.
Yes, Jessica?
Can I follow on a little bit, because I think that the paper is trying to, it's very interesting for a lot of comments and thoughts, but it's trying to do two different things, and I kind of got a little bit lost in the main focus of the paper was explaining why the incident happened the way it did, which I think gets into this sort of bureaucratic sort of they stumbled into it, and it's all very interesting, but then the other part of the paper is trying to explain this difference in media coverage, and I felt like I worry that you're not going to be convincing on either point if you try to do both, or at least they're currently kind of given equal weight. And particularly on the media side, it seemed to me that you needed a lot more time to develop the theory, and then also to explain why it was that this lack of this alignment in the Chinese case between public opinion and government preference is what explained that reduced or relatively less media coverage, because it was I don't dispute the sort of way that you described the relative amount of coverage, but the causal power of your argument I think needed to be given a lot more attention in the empirics, because I could explain the same outcome, which is China trying to downplay this before the public, with a different set of inputs. So I don't see the public as being uninterested in this, but rather it was the Chinese government was already doing everything. It didn't need to leverage to draw on this reservoir of public opinion, which was there. And in fact, I think the lack of participation in the protest in Kunming wasn't because there wasn't interest, because they tried to shut it down. And so I think that the lack or the sort of relatively quiet attention given in the Chinese media was actually the fear of further inciting what was already kind of substantial public attention, or would have been even more. So it's rather than this sort of lack of alignment. So I think that maybe that's just because that's the part that I'm really interested in, but there are a lot of alternative explanations, or just I would really like to see that argument that you make fleshed out and given more weight, because right now I think a lot of time is being taken up by this other piece, which is itself very interesting. So it's kind of like, okay, write 2 papers, it's sort of, but I think that they're working a little bit at cross purposes in the sense of taking up space.
Maybe I should add something to the discussion of the event that really was important and had a lot to do with the focus of the media efforts, both in China and Vietnam, diplomatic as well as media efforts, and that was that after protests were very widespread, but then riots in which people were killed and factories, Taiwanese factories, Korean factories, Chinese factories were all basically their gates were broken and they were stormed. And needless to say, the Vietnamese government didn't want this to continue. And this brought a whole different issue of we need public order into the discussion. And also, there was a tremendous amount of dissonance in the top leadership in the Vietnamese Politburo about, should we stand up to China, basically, should we change our policy toward China? And so China had a reason to cool down, and Vietnam had a reason to cool down. And that's what they did, and part of the instrumentality of the cooling down was media, but Vietnam had to capture their credibility with the public, whereas China had to keep the public from getting too excited about Chinese being killed and Chinese being evacuated from central Vietnam because of the riots.
Cathy, you have a question?
Yeah, so basically I think my question is very similar to the previous 2 comments. Like, in general, I'm just wondering, like, the Chinese moderate public opinion towards Vietnam, to what extent is it because it was contained by the CCP for a long time, and also related, to what extent it's just moderate about Vietnam, but overall very enthusiastic or very attentive to the South China Sea problem in general. And so the second question is, this is also sort of related, to what extent the story that we see in this paper, to what extent depends on the government's confidence in public opinion being under control. And so that's kind of, I think you have the theory. I know this is the paper kind of application to your theory, so maybe you can flesh out the theory a little bit more in the paper so that we can get it more about the theoretical aspects to understand the variation of the story.
I agree with Jessica that I think this paper needs to address more about the alternative hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So in my dissertation, I've been thinking about the theory more, and I have more space to talk about the alternative hypothesis, like audience cost, whether the states are stoking the nationalism to use it for coercion purposes, or whether the state is using the nationalism to divert public attention from a domestic crisis to an international crisis. The reason we give much space to the original reason why Chinese placed the oil rig in the first place was it just seems like the elephant in the room that it needs to be answered in terms of one of the independent variables is state policy intent. Perhaps we can readjust this, how much space it takes and add more on the alternative hypothesis.
Just to add a note on the deep background to China-Vietnam relations. Of course, they were hostile, though not in unrestricted war from 79 to 91. And then in 2000, the relationship reached sort of full normalization with the 16-character formula, which included looking toward the future and not toward the past. Which cost me personally, because my book was translated, I have a book on China and Vietnam relations, and it was translated into Chinese, but it couldn't be published in China because it dealt with the history. So when they say don't talk about history, they mean don't publish on history. So the idea that the relationship, both sides have to manage the relationship rather than, even though neither side really likes the other very much. That's the mentality of the normal relationship, normal asymmetric relationship.
Eric?
It's a fairly minor point, but I wonder whether, looking at some of the anti-Japan protests that have taken place over the years, 2005 and then the more recent after the sale of the Senkakus, might get you some leverage on maybe one on this issue of asymmetry in the relationships and how that plays in terms of public responses and public views and such, and then also the way in which the actual crises played out. So China's response was very much like you're describing Vietnam's response, that they were, in a couple of these cases, the Chinese government was terrified by the public vehemence and anger and how these things were sort of taking on life of their own. And not only did they launch a very concerted, very systematic phase sort of media campaign, but also, I went and did interviews, and they sent down all of China's 12 Japan experts, from academia and think tanks and such. They sent them down to universities to give talks and explain why we needed patience and this, that, and the other thing. So, you might get some leverage there. There may be other factors other than asymmetry that would be interesting to play with, like the proximate causes. So, maybe this was China's action that precipitated the crisis. So maybe that was the deciding factor. I don't know, but I think the comparison might be interesting to play with.
Yes, please.
Have you considered extending your analysis to China versus Philippines? Despite being surrounded by water, the Philippines does not have a significant naval force, it's more of a coast guard than the Navy, and so China is likely to make more progress pushing Philippines around than Vietnam.
Well, it certainly is an interesting case, and Jessica has dealt with that in one of her recent papers.
Well, just on that note, I remember being in China when the standoff was happening, and there was on the front page of Global Times this huge story about Philippine turtle poachers, and then the part where Vietnam was dealing with, it was like, oh, Vietnam cracked down on those criminals. It was like, wait, the actual transgression was reversed in terms of which was being,
On the other hand, so I was there at that time, and we were doing interviews with our nuclear interlocutors, but getting an earful on this. And the military and strategic crowd was very careful to differentiate between a country that has a security treaty with the United States, the Philippines, and the fact that that could escalate to war with the United States, and this understanding, which I thought was terribly frightening, really, and naive, that a crisis with Vietnam couldn't escalate because there was no treaty, so the U.S. wouldn't get involved. And that this was a very sort of cut and dry, black and white view that they had. In fact, one of the folks...
But that's a biased sample you were dealing with, too.
What's that?
The people you were dealing with were nuclear strategy type people.
Well, some of them, yes. And, yeah.
They don't think
yes, right.
So in terms of other interesting cases, actually my dissertation, sorry to segue to a different project, deals with 19 territorial disputes China is engaged in. And, some of them are the Sino-Japanese 2005, 2010, 2012, and also the Scarborough Shoal 2013 between China and Philippines, 2016, the arbitration case, applying the theory I just described to these cases. And I find the 2005 and Sino-Japanese case and the 2016 arbitration case is just like the Vietnamese case in this 2014 oil rig crisis, that they're faced with a militant public but they intended for a moderate policy. So they used propaganda actually to pacify the public. Interestingly, in the 2010 between China and Japan and the 2012 the Scarborough Shoal, it's probably a different type of propaganda. So the state used the state media to publicize it, but no front page articles, no primetime TV shows. So they clearly had intention to publicize it, but with clear resolutions. So those I think are cases that conform more to audience cost theory, which Jessica has been working on.
So this is one possible reframing that deals with some of the issues that Jessica raised and others. Just an idea. You don't have to take the suggestion. And I don't even know if it's a good one, but what you could say is, here's asymmetry theory. Here is this case as a test, right? Do we see, here's what asymmetry theory would predict. Here's our test case. It does seem to conform. However, there are other theories. Let's see if those theories conform. And then you can use these cases like Japan, EP3, and others as almost robustness checks to say, well, if this is the mechanism that's actually affecting, well, we would expect to see a different outcome if applying this theory to a larger state or a state that's more middle-sized or more commiserate with China. So you can, it's just one possible way to conceive of it, of laying out the theory, testing the theory, giving some alternate hypotheses, followed by some robustness checks to demonstrate why your theory is actually the one at work, not those others. So it's just in terms of formatting, I think.
Questions? We still have 1 minute. I do have a few big questions. I don't think you can handle within 1 minute. I will save to the end. Any other quick questions, comments from the audience before we move on to our third paper?
Well, we do have time at the end, so if you want to give them now, you can give them now your comments.
Okay, so I really appreciate this paper. I think it provides a valuable comparative analysis. And some of my comments really build on the questions I have already asked. I think it's extremely interesting to understand this relationship in dietic form, Vietnamese, China. But I think the audience has already asked the question, how we can understand Chinese and the Vietnamese manipulation of media in a more networked fashion. Thinking about regional players like the Philippines, Japan, and Singapore, India, right? So what's their action may affect how Chinese and the Vietnamese government manipulation of media, and also where is the U.S. in this picture, right? And a second comment is about this theorizing of media in this research. So as a communication and media scholar, I really appreciate that you point out how nation-state use media to advance their policy agenda. But a lot of latest development in media research is focusing on the agency of media, like how media play this role as agenda setters, as gatekeepers, not just informing the public, but also educating the public and shaping both public opinions as well as policy agendas. And also, many of the audience members also talk about unpacking, right? I fully understand it's not always easy to really unpack, what's going on within the Chinese government or within the Chinese military. But we can unpack media, right? We tend to use this big roof term media. There are state-owned media, And there are, state-owned media owned by the central government, by the local government, and there are more market-oriented media. And the most important way, there are digital media, social media. I really appreciate that you have your paper using a search, right, based on Baidu. But I would hope that you will discuss how the government, even using this one-way perspective, how the state manipulated the media. I would really appreciate more insight about how the state work with a different mode of media, from state-owned to more market-oriented to social media. Yeah. We'll stop here.
Should we address the questions later and have Cathy? So we use, I agree that media is an agency, and we actually focus on the state media because we use state media as a proxy for state media policy. So the study is coming from political science, so this is very state focused, just studying what the state prefers. But I agree that we should, so beyond People's Daily and a slew of state media, we should look into other media as well to unpack the tenets of the media coverage.
The U.S. role in this.
Yeah, we'll probably put on like a different, a wrong. So we were thinking about how do we tie our paper into the theme of the conference, as Professor Womack pointed out, that the South China Sea dispute is one really important issue between U.S. and China right now, with the Chinese island building and activities, and the U.S. phone-up activities. So this case between China and Vietnam is really a crisis that the U.S. pays a lot of attention to, and which has the potential to disrupt Sino-U.S. relationship as well. And at the time, I'm based in D.C., and I saw there's lots of concern expressed in D.C. about this crisis. So you could see, that the imbalance between the U.S. There's lots of U.S. concern, there's lots of Vietnamese concern. But in China, there's just not, it's not talked a lot about in China. But we just hope that this, like being an issue that between you and China, and that could potentially disrupt the relationship, would be linked to the U.S.
I think that the specific disruption that was at risk with the oil rig thing, but not something China and Vietnam both backed away from, was a shift toward toward an alliance between Vietnam and the U.S. And so balancing against, rather than buffering its relationship with China with better U.S. relations. Vietnam's been pushing better relations with the U.S. for the last 25 years. And the U.S. has been a reluctant side, but as we got more interested in China and balancing against China, we got more interested in better relations with Vietnam. And there is some historically ill-founded optimism in Washington that Vietnam might might become some part of some alliance structure with the U.S. That would be extremely foolish on Vietnam's part and not likely to be done, because it had an experience with an alliance like that with the Soviet Union from 1978 to 1986, if you want to date it to Gorbachev's Vladivostok. So they don't want to make their foreign policy dependent on the United States, and U.S. can't supply what China does as far as Vietnamese development.
Very good, thank you. And now let's move on to our third paper by Cathy Wu.
Thank you. So both the good news and bad news is I'm the last barrier to launch. So I want to thank Josh for inviting me back to Austin, I'm still adjusting to cold weather and humidity in the eastern coast, so it's very good to be back. So the motivating case in my paper actually happened 10 years ago, so I think it's worth providing a little bit background of my motivating case. So exactly 10 years ago, in around February, March in 2008, and so there was some unrest and riot in Tibet, and that led to, of course, the crackdown of Chinese government. And soon after, there was a huge torch relay of the Beijing Olympics all over the world, not just in China, but like in many Western countries, United States. And because of the crackdown of Chinese government in Tibet, right before the torch relay, so during the torch relay, the torch relay actually received lots of protests and oppositions from Western leaders, politicians, activists in almost all stops outside of China. And so that kind of protests and oppositions are quite similar in most of the Western countries. But very interestingly, we are seeing a very varying intensity of Chinese reactions towards those protests. And in particular, I found that Chinese people were particularly angry about the protest from France, especially in Paris. And so there are lots of like anti-French discussions and protests after the torch relay and during the torch relay. But you didn't see many like strong oppositions or nationalist sentiments against other Western countries, even though there are also like protests oppositions against Chinese violation of human rights in Tibet. So that kind of motivates my question, and I wanted to understand like why, given the similar protest against Chinese violation of human rights, and we see a very different levels of intensity of Chinese popular nationalism against those criticism. So, and this is a great panel with all these like one of the best scholars in Chinese nationalism. But when I look at those literature, I was realizing that a lot of this literature in Chinese nationalism was mainly about trying to understand, say, maybe the origin and consequences of Chinese nationalism. And generally, they understand Chinese nationalism as a product of, say, patriotic education, propaganda, or a product or reaction of the Western criticism, or some sentiment to going back to the glorious past of ancient China. So I think these are very good explanation to understand Chinese popular nationalism. But if you think about that origin, it's not very helpful in understanding why do we see these various intensity, like why Chinese people were particularly angry with France, with Paris, like what happened in Paris, rather than what happened in other countries. So that's kind of like what I'm trying to do in this paper. And the answer I provide in this paper is actually simple, that I try to understand this varying intensity by looking at what kind of image Chinese people have had towards those foreign countries before those protests, before these events during the torch relay. And so basically, like the idea is that if Chinese people tend to have a positive image about foreign country before, say like they consider France as a very friendly country, as a country friendly to China. And so you are going to have a more positive expectations about, like, you are going to show goodwill, you are going to show friendship, you are going to like welcome this torch relay and like just showing all the enthusiastic sentiment as Chinese people do. And so, but if Chinese people consider another country as just a continuing enemy, therefore they don't really have that kind of expectation about those foreigners are going to show the same or similar level of enthusiasm towards torture relay. So they will not have that kind of expectation. And so because of this difference of image before what happened during the torture relay, and that created different expectation, and that leads to kind of a shock when they see that those supposedly friendly country actually show strong oppositions during the torture relay, and therefore they would have stronger reactions, say to French politicians and activists. And so that's kind of the story I'm trying to explain in the paper. So in the paper, I to kind of like illustrate that this idea, I give more detailed examples about showing that why, based on some public opinion polls showing that why, like to what extent, like Chinese people before the torture relay used to have a very, very positive opinions about France, while compared to United States, the Chinese people tend to have a very negative opinion about United States. And so how this kind of difference of images about those countries and created a shock to among Chinese people about what happened in Paris. And therefore after that, so after the torture relay, we actually see a stronger reactions against French politicians, against France in general. Some of the examples including the dramatic decrease or the dramatic increase of a negative opinion about France during the given opinion poll like a year later. So that was one example, and so you're going to see a huge decrease of the French image among Chinese people in 2009, but we didn't see much difference about how Chinese people view United States a year later. And another example is that I sort of like look for how Chinese people were discussing about France and about United States in some online forums. And what I found is that in 2008, so even though in general there are more posts, like online posts about United States, because like still like United States is kind of like one of the most important countries that people pay attention to. But those of discussions about United States in 2008 was mainly actually about the Olympic events themselves. They're talking about like all these athletes, all these Olympic games themselves. But when you look at the posts about France, the more percentage of those posts were about how they feel so angry about what happened in torture relay, and so people really expressed lots of anger against France during the torture relay. That accounted for the majority of the online posts in 2008. And so towards the end of the paper, and I also kind of discussed a little bit about why I think we have, like Chinese people tended to have a positive image about France, which in my opinion was not accurate. And so that image was actually corrected after the torture relay event. So then I kind of discussed about like why Chinese people had this kind of wrong but positive image about France before 2008, and that was mainly, in my opinion, about related to the propaganda or the lack of direct communication between Chinese people and Western people in general, and that kind of direct communication. I think there are lots of different reasons I'm happy to talk about during Q&A, but I kind of emphasize the block of Chinese government, that Chinese government did not really provide an accurate understanding of what Western people actually view China before the torture relay. So and so that kind of like, in a sense, that Chinese government was building a wall between the Chinese people and the Western people, and so they don't really have this kind of correct image about Western, about France in particular. But that war was sort of penetrated or damaged a little bit during the Olympic event, during the torture relay, because with that kind of event, with that kind of big scale of events, it's first of all, it's much more difficult for Chinese government to block all the information from outside. And on the other hand, it's Chinese people are more enthusiastic to seek for information about how they are viewed by foreigners during that particular event. And so because of this kind of efforts from outside and efforts from inside, and that kind of just tear down the wall during the Torture Day and Beijing Olympics in general. And that created a shocking moment for Chinese people to realize, okay, we are actually not received very well in the West. So that's kind of like sum up my paper, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Great. So as the moderator, I will ask the first question for this round. I've used my power. So I could not believe it is 10 years, right? And I think it's a wonderful paper to remind us about what happened 10 years ago and the long-term implication for what's going on today. Wonderful paper. My comments is, first of all, I remember, and I actually Googled it right now. So this is according to Reuters, right? April 11, 2008, Beijing Reuters, a wheelchair-bound Chinese torchbearer has rocketed to national fame after funding of protesters in Paris, becoming a symbol of Chinese defiance of global demonstration backing Tibet. Jingjing, 27 years old, right? So, do you think this particular case play a very important role in this, very dramatic response from domestic Chinese public, which leading to this differential response to France in the U.S. at that time?
Okay, yeah, very good question. And I think that dramatic event definitely adds to lots of anger. And in the paper, I also talk a little bit about, I think right after Paris, what happened in Paris, and I think the organizers sort of learned it, and also they try to do something about what happened next in other stops in Torture Day. And that, I think that's why I think in San Francisco they actually decided to change the route to avoid all these like protests that were already there. So I think because of that deliberate efforts, the stops later in the United States, actually you didn't see as many protests as what happened in Paris. So that might explain a little bit, but so on the other hand though, we still see like just in terms of the criticism from Western like politicians and activists, and I will argue that if we look at that and rather than just about what happened on the street, and I think that criticism was still quite similar, and so I still kind of like want to make a case that the criticism from those Western countries are kind of similar, but I do agree with that dramatic event by Jingjing, like sort of pop out and just anger Chinese people much more often. Yeah. Thank you.
Nice. Eric and Ye and Professor Lee, of course. Yeah.
Another great paper. So another great paper. I had one, I guess, smallish comment and then a larger point. So the comment is just, I guess I'd want to hear a little bit more about how the events in France and the United States were reported. So to make your case, I think, as compelling as it could be, you want to show that there was comparable reporting to which the public was reacting. And then, combined with that, obviously there's going to be a lot more reporting about the United States. So, these specific events, but also the reporting more generally. So if this is, one of the few data points you're getting about France, then yes, it's going to move the needle more than. So, you probably want to address that and acknowledge that, but you still have a big point here. And that this gets at my larger point, which really pertains to both these latter two papers, and that is that, I don't know how the rest of the audience feels, but in my mind, there's an opportunity here which hasn't been fully seized. I mean, there's an image of public opinion and nationalism in China that's, everything is manipulated by the government, things can be switched on and off, and that's just simply not true in my studies of China's reaction to events in Japan. And I think, the stories that both of you tell also would bear that out. And if you situated the framing of the paper in that regard, I think it would help a lot. You know, I mean, as it is now, it's fascinating and interesting, but your eyes might glaze over a little bit. But I think there's a point here about how China works and how we should think about China and how dangerous nationalism may or may not be that isn't fully made both in this case.
Okay, Professor?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the paper as well, and I think you did a great job in making the point. It would be strengthened, I think, if you would mesh it with high politics. At the time, a big issue was Sarkozy. He wanted to meet with the Dalai Lama. I think this followed Merkel's meeting with the Dalai Lama. The Chinese were extremely sensitive to this at a high politics level. On the Olympics itself, George W. Bush said emphatically he was going to the Olympics. The Europeans were saying, no, they're not going to go. But Bush said, I don't care what's going on in Tibet, I'm going to the Olympics. And George W. Bush, maybe America wasn't popular, but George W. Bush was I used to do speaking in Asia in various places, and and China was the only place where he was talking. So it really stuck in my mind. I mean, people liked him, you know, and so I think getting those dimensions in there would say, okay, well, I think you make a point, but I think it's. And they canceled the European-China summit because of Sarkozy trying to go see the Dalai Lama. So I think when you deal with high politics, it might just it would enhance the credibility of your case.
Yeah, so we will go with the order. Mingye, Marian, Professor Lee, and I see around the same time, you and then Jessica.
And you can put me on the bottom.
I'm really, really happy with all these responses. Yes, without any further ado, please.
Again, I think the theoretical framework is more robust than just this one single case, and I wonder whether you can have a universe of similar cases. And just on the Olympics, for instance, South Korea and Japan, when South Korea was seen as a friend, and then the Chinese online hostility toward the South Korean protests were much harder than in the Japanese. I think more explanation actually follows, but so far it's just the two cases, and you do have the alternative explanations. And outside the Olympics, there will be other issues in the meeting the Dalai Lama, policy over even South China Sea, because the bigger point you are trying to get is actually there's a value of being hostile to China, right? And you being consistently aggressive and assertive for the China actually is more moderating. And this will be more useful as China now tries to get people on board with the One Belt, One Road, and the countries who consistently reject it actually gets better deal. And so in Southeast Asia, the friends of China could not get lower concessional loans, while these enemies or kind of competitive rivals actually got better deals. So if you can extrapolate this more strategic, interactive dynamic, it will be really a big contribution to the field.
I have a similar point kind of about how to deal with this concept of renegades in China's eyes. So in 2008, my understanding is that after that image of Jingjing, the torchbearer, was like struggling to fight off the protesters, President Sarkozy sent a letter expressing his support for the torchbearer. And then I guess following the Olympics, Hu Jintao also sent a special envoy, right, to kind of help rebuild that relationship. I think there's a really interesting comparison potentially to be made between how that perception gap and renegade issue was dealt with then versus the France-China relationship now. And I'm thinking particularly of France pushing back against Trump going all in with Taiwan at the outset of the administration, and France coming out and saying, "Whoa, Trump, like hit the brakes. You don't want to revise Taiwan policy. You just stay the tried and true course." And I think it'd be a really interesting comparison. It may well be beyond the scope of your paper, but it's something that merits looking at.
I think then it's Professor Lee, right?
Oh, yeah. Not a question, just a comment to your presentation. I guess when you talk about the excessive reaction to the incident in Paris during the torture relay, that lots of people in China believe France was a friendly country. There was I guess there was a historical base behind their perception. France, yes, it was a member of the allies to the United States, but unlike many other Western European countries, it displayed a sort of autonomy from the U.S.-dominated organization, and France was the very first Western European country that built a diplomatic relationship with China, I guess as early as in 1964. So yes, in the Chinese conflict, there was a feeling that France was more friendlier to China, and now how come this country appears to be so anti-Chinese as the incident indicated? I guess the problem is not with the public's general perception of this incident. It has to do with how the Chinese media produce such a misconception of a European country as a liberal society, where different opinions exist out there, and the government's control of incidents that happen during that process was very limited and unpredictable. It's on China. In China, yes, when there is event that has to be displayed, it's the strict control by the government. But that's not the case in Europe. So I guess that has to do with how the media produce an image to influence the attitude of the general public.
Professor Yu?
Yeah, I felt like we already touched on my point, so it was just out of curiosity, just in terms of the logic that you're making in your argument that the Chinese government is trying to create its own image to the world, and how these populations viewpoint in China in the world is reflected. I mean, it's somehow is what is it? Going through the lenses of the government control of information about it. And still curious about, I mean, as you can explore a little bit more in your paper, was that I understand that it's going through this government control or lenses of controlling information about that, but then we still see the difference between the United States and France, right? Why is that the Chinese government wanting to make its image, or why is this Chinese government control this information, and why that in the United States, when the United States protests occurred in the United States, why is it the Chinese population was not so resistant to the protests in the United States, while the Chinese population was so resistant to the France? What was the difference in terms of dealing with the France and the United States? I think that's something that you could mention somewhere here. And then another question that I was thinking about after reading this was that what happens after the population corrects the image of foreign countries? What happens after that? So, because you are dealing with 2008, that was pretty 10 years, pretty long time ago. So, what's going to happen after this population correct the image of foreign countries?
Great. First, I really enjoyed your paper. It's really great to see you moving in this direction. I think it's particularly interesting to look at these so-called new targets, or different targets of Chinese nationals, because there's been so much written about Japan and the United States. I think my main suggestion would be that the paper, both theoretically and empirically, I think is overreaching in making this comparative claim between reactions to France and reactions to the United States. So theoretically, you argue that people have a stronger hatred against a renegade than a continuing enemy or competitors. I think if you had questions that asked about sentiment against, say, Japan and France, there's no way that the anti-French sentiment is going to overtake the anti-Japanese sentiment. I think that Roxetter already raised a number of reasons why, in the specific case of the torch relay, it didn't make sense for there to be as strong a reaction against the United States as there was against France. And you have some of those details in your paper itself. And so I think that there's so much that's valuable here that I don't want the paper to sort of founder on this, making this claim about it being sort of worse against France than the United States. Because I think on its own, it's intrinsically interesting to see the process of how a former friend, an image of a friendly country gets tarnished. And I think that you might, so the data ends at 2008. I really wonder about this over time persistence of this effect. I think that Lauren's, the comparison with how Trump's about face on Taiwan, whether you would see similarly short-lived effects. I don't know. It's interesting because I think the generally understanding is that that the Carrefour, it was like that thing blew over in a flash. Sarkozy made up for it, etc. So that there wasn't this persistent effect. I guess maybe Norway. There may find other sort of comparisons that might be interesting as a way of sort of, if you take out some of that comparison to the United States, what would you fill in to kind of tease out a context for this? But overall, it was great to read.
My impression was that at the time of this, Paris was a principal tourist destination for Chinese tourists, and as it is again. You might use the numbers of tourists to France as a measure for how long lasting this effect is.
Just two quick things that might affect the intensity of Chinese outrage toward France. One, sort of media low politics to complement Bob's point about high politics. From the March 11th riots, and especially in Lhasa, the Chinese media presented this as an attack by ethnic Tibetans on the Chinese, the Han population of Lhasa, in which how many people, 11 or 13 people were killed. There was a group of Chinese shop girls who were burned to death in their shop, which is not usually reported in American media. And then the media reports on the Tibetan demonstrations in the West included some obviously false things, some pictures from old movies, various things like that, which were then used in China to show how little understanding there was of Tibet. And all of this is happening the month before France. And so that would be one thing. And another thing would be that the whole build-up, the whole Olympic education movement in China was world brotherhood, world understanding, et cetera, the opposite of turning a girl in a wheelchair out on the sidewalk. So, just the contrast there is more than just not understanding the West. Is coming at the end of a pretty high-powered media campaign on the West doesn't understand Tibet.
Josh?
Yeah. Well, I really like the way these three papers kind of played together. I thought it made for a great panel, and it made for a great reading. And reading the three together, I learned a lot about these topics. So I was really happy about that. I think everybody's touched on some big things, but just a couple of points that maybe I can throw on. And this again is more of a structure thing. I'm obsessed with structure. So you know, it's me, not you, right? But I think that one of the reasons that Eric mentioned this kind of eyes glaze over thing is because you could have a tighter structure, and that would actually, if you tighten the structure, you're going to lose a bunch of words, and you're going to crystallize your point. So here's again one possible of many structures that you could use. So what are perception gaps? Define a perception gap for us. What is it? What is the problem? Why do they occur? Are they particularly likely to occur in autocracies? Because the mechanism you're putting forward would suggest that that's true, right? That people have a perception gap because the government's hiding something from them, and then they come to a realization when they find out what they had been hidden from them. So we would expect that in autocracies the problem would be worse. Now, what about the China case? Tell us about the China case. And then what are the consequences of this gap for policymakers, for decision making in general, right? And then what can be done about this, right? Is this just a natural effect of autocracy, that if you're going to control the press, you're going to end up with people not knowing things, and that could come back and bite you later? Or is this something that the government, knowing about the problem, could find a way to bring people along, maybe slowly, so that they have a realistic expectation, so they don't have this shock, cold water in the face when they realized, oh my God, I'm not as cool as I thought I was. And, you know, and then, you know, just one, and this might be a nitnoid thing I might be picking on, but on page 10 you say, the more familiar an outgroup is perceived, the more positive opinion the public has toward it. Well, in studying China-Africa, I would say it's the antithesis. The more Chinese people show up in Africa, the more Africans are saying we're being invaded by Chinese people, and they get concerned. So not, you know, you may know somebody, the more you get to know them, you don't necessarily like them more. So this, you know, I would question that assumption, although I do think it's a very widely held assumption. Oh, you'll just get to know me, you'll like me. Sometimes that's not the case. And so, you know, you've got to at least demonstrate that causality. But I think that if you can structure this argument properly, I think there's a lot here to make this into a really interesting and, as Min said, you know, great contribution to the literature in general.
Yaping?
So first, I have a different word suggestion for the theory. I definitely think perception gap, the wording perception gap is more academic. I'm thinking of the word disenchantment. So it's more, so perception gap can work both ways. But here, in this case, you're only using one way, so disenchantment. So the Chinese word disenchanted by the French. You can take it as you will. The second point is that I'm totally convinced by the argument. I was just thinking, how much of it was a target selection rather than an intensity of nationalism? It could be possible that the Chinese were feeling equally hostile against the Americans and the French, but they were just picking the French to be the target. So this relates to alternative hypothesis, like would it be possible to pick the weaker state or just the easier target? So these alternative hypotheses should be addressed more in the paper. Okay. And in terms of extension, you know, applying your theory to other cases, I don't know whether you want to do it in this paper, but I just thought of the 2013 scapegoat shoal incident between China and Philippines. So the Chinese stood up in front of KFC to protest American enterprise, and they just thought they were angry at the American involvement in this Sino-Philippines crisis. And another case is the SAD whole crisis, that both Americans and Koreans were involved, but the Chinese were more angry towards the Koreans.
All right, so thank you so much for all these great comments. I won't respond to each of them because I think I only have 3 minutes left, but I will make 3 points. And I think first is, I think this is mainly to respond to Eric and probably Bob Sauer's point. So Eric, you mentioned about comparable reporting. So I kind of didn't focus on the protest. So I focus, when I talk about US case, I talk more about how the US media reported about the riot in Tibet rather than what happened in Torture Day, exactly because of the reason that I mentioned to Wenhong, is that because the Torture Day happened in San Francisco was already deliberately scaled down, and like, so I was trying to like, because there are already some of the intervening effects, and that's why I think it's not very good to compare just based on these two torture-related events, and that's why I focus more when I compare their similar criticism between US and France. I pay more attention to how Western medias were reporting about riot in Tibet, and especially how those reports are actually pop out in all these like online websites, because those reports were not mentioned by Chinese official media, obviously, but they were picked by all these ordinary Chinese like netizens on websites. So I pay more attention to that just because of, I was not very, I was a little bit hesitant to just compare about the protest in Torchillet. And high politics, that's absolutely right. And I think I should add that in the paper. And initially I focused more on the popular nationalism. But I think Bob is absolutely right. Like George W. Bush was much more welcome because he like didn't want to meet Dalai Lama. Although I think Pelosi, the diplomatic leader in Congress, I think she actually met Dalai Lama as well as Sarkozy. So, and another point, a second point, this is mostly related to Yun's and Professor Lee's point, and I think that is a very, very important point, and I think that might be kind of an extension of this project, which is when I look at how Chinese government was trying to say distort some information, I did realize that sometimes Chinese government wanted to demonize certain countries, and maybe United States, like they always portray United States as an enemy, but try to build up some friendly image about European countries, especially Western European countries. And I find that they also did something similar when it comes to, say, nowadays like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and but now that created another kind of like shocking moment after they say the sunflower movement or the umbrella movement. So like I think the next kind of extension of this paper would be like something I really wanted to study is that why, like how did Chinese government, like when they portray different images of the certain countries, like why sometimes they focus, like demonize certain countries, but portray the more like overly positive image about the other countries. So I think that's something I'm definitely planning to do. And the last point, I forgot the last point. Oh, so about whether this hostility is kind of short-lived or like long-lived. So I think in this paper, I only look at the public opinion poll like a year later, like in 2009. And so just based on that, basically, so even though Sarkozy sent a letter to Jinping and like all the and try to kind of recover. So in this version of paper, I kind of make a point that once this image is broken, it's kind of more difficult to kind of recover, at least in the short run. But I think you're right, I should probably look at more like public opinion poll like 3 years later. I think now it's recovered, but I think it's probably, if we look at it in just 2 years or 3 years after the event, I think that if I remember correctly, like the image about France was quite negative, like just a couple of years after that. But I think now, like already, well, 10 years later, it's already recovered. I will stop here, but thank you so much for all these comments.
Thank you very much for the answer, and let's give our hands to this